back to brain molting, I see the ego as this rigid shell blocking the fluidity of the brain. And when it cracks, if somebody experiences trauma or shattering their belief systems in some way, then that crack sort of expands and the brain can have a tendency to molt. And then it's more fluid, and it's doing that in order to actually rearrange some of its mental models to assimilate that experience. And then in map consciousness, when things are so fluid, and then one comes back and that shell sort of reforms again in order to keep one grounded in consensus reality to some degree. When one hits that low point, it's still important to look back and rearrange one's mental models again of the experience of map consciousness. So map consciousness rearranges mental models, and then we come back, and then we need to look back and rearrange mental models, rearrange our life, redesign our life, recreate ourselves from some of the information of that experience. And that's harvest your mania, practice your mania, embody your mania. Create a world where we don't have to walk around with these ego shells. The trouble is when we hit the bottom of this recrystallization process, when consciousness gets filtered down to a point where we're recrystallized in this consensus reality, we're no longer perceiving at that other level. We're pathologized. When it takes time to heal, just like it takes time to heal after any kind of transformation. Even when the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, it has to take some time to let its wings expand, let it dry off, pick off the last bits of the chrysalis that was a protective house but is no longer serving a person. Just like the ego is a protective house, but it's no longer serving us. We've pathologized brain metamorphosis. Just as going in a freezing cold lake will make us shake, we can actually consciously over time get acclimated to that lake. We can put our feet in one day, then we can put up to our knees the next day, then up to our waist, then up to our neck the next day, and then we get all the way in for 1 second, then the next day 2 seconds, and then all of a sudden we can stay in this freezing cold lake for a minute or 2 minutes. But we have to go and put ourselves in that freezing cold lake. What I'm saying is map consciousness is sort of like that. It's like we've been thrown into a freezing cold lake, but we've never had a chance to get acclimated, and it just feels cold because we're not used to it. So map consciousness happens in the opposite way. We're put in a cold lake for a long period of time without the chance to get acclimatized. But then after, when we come back, we can actually move towards consciously making ourselves acclimated to that medium, to that way of being. So then if we get thrown in the cold lake again, it's not going to feel cold. So I feel like even with map consciousness, at some point, it doesn't feel like some kind of different altered state. It doesn't feel like a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It doesn't feel like an extraordinary state of consciousness. It feels like our ordinary state of consciousness. So the real beauty of it is making it feel ordinary. Because we're all extraordinary and we're all ordinary at the same time. There's a lot of people out there trying to be extraordinary. Yet it's the universe that extraordinizes us. We've been normalized into mediocrity, and the universe comes in and extraordinizes us. It gives us a different map. It gives us something else and another way to move towards. It's not just something else to move towards. It's a different way of moving that will move us towards that something else. The brain is trying to acclimate to hyperperception, to sensitivity, just like it takes time to adjust to bright lights if we've been in the dark for a long time. But eventually we do adjust. It's an adjustment in our perception. We go from ego deception to hyperperception. And so the first time our brain molts, it feels very sensitive and it feels very raw. Whereas the next time and the next time, we're more used to that raw state, so it doesn't feel as raw. And we're not recognizing this as brain growth. We're not recognizing this as the brain breaking its own barriers. The brain is growing roots into consciousness itself instead of just being rooted in the ego. Some plants have one long root going down. It's a tap root, whereas other plants have very branchy roots. Well, we have a tap root, one branch, one track mind of the ego in terms of desire. And then when we grow roots into consciousness, our brain cells grow into consciousness. It's like they're growing consciousness. By growing into consciousness, the brain cell growing roots into consciousness, it's growing us as different plants, as different trees of human beings. And this molting wouldn't be necessary if our brain was never made dull, insensitive, stuck, hardened by the ego. And again, it's just the brain trying to learn. It's neuroplasticity. So once we get used to this neuroplastic process happening in our brain and always learning, it's also about what do we do with what we're learning. Or how do we share in this learning? And I've talked about before how part of this process of self-dialogue is just to get that energy to move through myself, for myself. I wouldn't have said all this if I wasn't talking to myself in this way. And it's possible that it will prevent that extreme spurt from happening because I'm consistently engaging my brain in this way, engaging my brain about the perceptions it perceives, engaging the seer. A lot of us just engage the mere. What are my emotions? What am I this? What am I that? We're not actually learning about learning and life itself. We're concerned about that which drains our life energy, the ego process. I don't even think the ego is a process. It's like a congealing of the neurons, thinking this thought and associating it to this thought, and then all of a sudden these nerves are all strung together, and we think we're this linear tunnel of thoughts and judgments and opinions that we have, when we're the whole brain. We're not using our whole brain. A phrase came to me today: waiting forever for nothing to happen. I don't know what that really means, but now that I think about it, could be something related to surrender. Also the desireless state. And it's waiting, just waiting and witnessing forever, eternity, which is always now, for nothing to happen, for no thing to happen, for that thing that tries to make things into things to not happen. And we think we're creatures, we think we're these passive things. We think we're these things, but we're actually creators. Even bacteria create the atmosphere or create the soil conditions necessary for the plants to grow. So it's all connected. It's all one thing, even though we think things are separate things. I feel like psychosis is an ego layer forming. So generally people go up into mania and it's all wonderful. But as the ego layer is reforming, as those neurons are starting to congeal, it's almost like ice and water. So when water's liquid, it's liquid, and then when it freezes, it's ice. So in a way, the ego reforming is just like water to ice. It's almost like the energy is being diverted back into those frozen neurons, those narrow reality tunnel tracks. And it feels scary because one has gone from being so expansive and using one's whole brain, and the brain and the perceptual field is starting to narrow down. And so what actually feels like death is the narrowing of the perceptual field. And that's probably just what death is in the physical body. It's like our perceptual field just gets smaller and smaller as the oxygen is withdrawn from our system. But then we go somewhere. Just like I experienced consciousness leaving my body, going somewhere else, whether I actually physically died or not, the perceptual field of my body narrowed down to next to nothing, and then consciousness went somewhere else. Consciousness as perception probably can never be destroyed. We think matter can't be destroyed, but it takes a perceptual apparatus to see the matter that is the matter of one's personal reality. And so when that is withdrawn, where does all that matter and energy go that was what was projected and experienced and fed back to the being whose perception disappeared? I feel like bipolar or trans consciousness it's a different language, so then we use language differently. It's the language of perception. It's the language of seeing and putting words to what we see instead of what we saw. When we say our judgments, we're saying what we saw, we're not saying what we see. Judgments are programmed from the past, so anything that's a judgment is something we saw before and decided to form into a program, which prevents us from seeing and saying what we see. Transconscious people are poets, and normal conscious people are know-its, as in know-it-alls. When you don't know anything, you can see the magic of the universe. You can see. Knowing prevents seeing. Judging, as in knowing, prevents seeing. Transconsciousness is like metaphor consciousness. It's seeing the similarities. It's simile consciousness. Instead of perceiving indifferences and judging in order to separate things and categorize, it's seeing similar things, to see patterns and make relationships. We see the relationship between everything, not the division, not the measured value projected from our conditioned thoughts of society. When we're not measuring everything with our mind, we can see the immeasurable, which is the relatedness of things. Because if two things are related, then each of those things that are related to something else, and something else, and something else at infinitum. So all of a sudden we see that everything has this value of relatedness instead of all these false values we superimpose on things in order to justify our destruction of it. But when we see how things are related, it's very difficult to destroy things, because we see that if we're related to that which we're relating to and we destroy what we're relating to, we're destroying ourselves. I was thinking my videos to myself maybe should come with a warning label. And perhaps it's too late. That do not listen if you're not prepared to have your ego molt. If it molts in favor of raw perception and in favor of sensitivity, you may just have to act on what you perceive, and that might just change things. If you don't see it, you won't act. And only that which doesn't want to see can see, because want is desire, and desire blocks perception. When you see without the ego as consciousness, consciousness acts on the brain cells and grows new brain cells so you can see and act. The only action is in the brain. Everything else happens. If we couldn't learn to eat, if we couldn't learn to make food and eat, we would need somebody else to feed us. If we can't learn to see, if we can't learn perception, perception is learning, then we need other people's perceptions, and we need to record those. So once we start seeing things, that starts to erase other people's perceptions, because you can see things for yourself. And the brain will always favor seeing something clearly for yourself over something somebody else told you to believe. I wonder too if the sound coming out of our ears is our inner voice. And it's so faint that most of us don't hear it. And we can't hear it because our brain is so loud. But if our brain was quiet, if there's sound coming out of our ears, we're going to hear that sound that comes out of our ears. I've heard the term edutainment, which comes from entertainment and education. And I was thinking about enterbrainment. Thinking about that which thinks, seeing that which sees. Looking at how we look, zooming out. That show, the OA, this is a spoiler alert, so don't listen to the next 20 seconds. It's about recording the soundscapes of the other side of the death realm. I think that when people go into map consciousness and they're perceiving higher levels of consciousness and they're talking, they're actually creating the soundscape of those other worlds that other people don't have the brain cells to see. But if they listen to somebody who can see that, their brain cells might actually grow, because sound creates brain cells. And the perception of what that sound is pointing to, and seeing that, is giving voice to that other half we all share. It's a different soundscape, and it's creating a different brainscape, which will create a different heartscape, which will create a different landscape. But instead we're made into scapegoats. Blind people turn us into scapegoats. In terms of blindness as well, I had this insight, and I don't know if it's true, that once we're able to integrate and walk between worlds, we might have a tendency to be fearful of how we are and being captured. But if we're able to integrate and speak in this other way and be in this other way, people who are blind won't really notice what we're doing. So we don't necessarily have to be afraid. It could be challenging with people that already know us. So if somebody thinks they know you, and they think that you're mentally ill, it might be good to not really speak in that way with those people. But strangers, it could be okay to give yourself the opportunity to be that self that you would be in that other state of consciousness. So be the highest state of consciousness you can be. Be aware of who you're speaking to. Are you speaking to a blind person? Are you speaking to somebody who thinks they know you, meaning they're even more blind? Or are you speaking to somebody who might want to see what you're saying and what you're talking about? And it could just be a playful game, I don't know. The game might actually be make blind people see. I'm always curious about what the game is. Because if it's not a fun game, it's not really worth playing. And even this process of self-dialogue, it's enjoyable, I guess. It's something I can do. It's something that feels like it flows right now. Though if it was summertime, I'd probably be outside more. So there might be a season to self-dialogue, and it might be a way to reinforce brain cells and reinforce the fluidity of the brain cells. I actually feel like this is the harvest. Self-dialogue is the harvest. And also planting seeds, as in growing new brain cells. And then there's the practice, which is in daily life, will that which I created as context of a higher level of consciousness arise as what unfolds in my words and language? Or will it be the lower levels? And I feel stronger in the higher levels, actually, because I've talked to myself so much about it. So if somebody came up to me and started yakking on about mental illness, I would just be like, I don't buy it, sorry. Maybe I wouldn't even feel the need to say that. I guess part of it is with self-dialogue is getting to a point where one doesn't care if the other person sees or not. I remember being in map consciousness the first time and feeling like I could see so much, and I wanted my friend to see it, and I wanted everybody to see it, and I was like, can you see this? Can you see this? And so excited, and it seemed like people could see stuff, but if I really think about it, they probably couldn't see what I was talking about, but it felt like they could. Whereas there might be, in dialogue with other people, I think that's the next thing, is dialogue with other people and seeing if we can see together, not necessarily if they can see what I've said. Who cares about that? Because seeing is in the moment, so seeing something together in dialogue. And after that, after I come back from California, I might just go a bit nuts in terms of changing my appearance just for fun. Like, I don't really feel any desire to, but it could be kind of quirky. I sort of want to embody my mania, like look like a maniac even though I don't feel like one. It just feels normal now. And maybe there are higher energy states that will come in, but I don't think it's necessary per se. Maybe those higher energy states have done their job now. Maybe they just wanted me to talk to myself, just like I talked to myself in the very first time I was in map consciousness. I'm going to that lady today that does the hair analysis, and it's supposed to give epigenetic information. I don't know if she's going to do live blood cell analysis, but I'm curious just to see the state of my health, of my body. I haven't really been eating healthy for a number of months. Just been eating overnight oats and rice with Indian food sauce that's from a package. I remember Dr. David Hawkins saying, as consciousness goes up, the need for resources goes down. And I always found that interesting, though it doesn't really arise in mind very often. But I feel I can see what he's saying. At higher levels of consciousness, we don't necessarily need so many vitamins, so many minerals, so many comforts, so much food. I feel like even at a certain level of consciousness, the world just takes care of the person in some way. Like if somebody's just so joyful and has some kind of joyful business and things, it probably just happens wonderfully and organically, versus somebody trying to sell ketchup popsicles to a woman in white gloves. And that line is from Tommy Boy, the movie. And part of it too is I feel the body is very relaxed. It's not making all this cortisol, which drains vitamins, which we're not stressed, we're not desiring. All that desiring wiring probably warps the brain and warps the way the body processes information and vitamins and everything too. So, and actually I remember when I was doing my Rolfing 10 series, halfway through I realized I don't need any of this. I don't need any of these vitamins, I don't need any of these things, and I was coming off my meds at the time, and then I failed to come off meds. But maybe it was true at the level of consciousness I was at that moment. It might have been true that I was right with that insight that I don't need vitamins and minerals and things. But since I wasn't able to stay at that level of consciousness, since it wasn't earned as a stage in my brain, it was just a temporary state, then when I went down in consciousness, then I did need those vitamins because my body was not processing an energy and nutrients in the same way, and then it wasn't good. Like maybe if I had stayed on the vitamins, I would have been more successful at coming off the medications. So it could be true that an insight at a certain level of consciousness needs to marinate a little bit in order to ensure that it's a stage of consciousness and not just a temporary state. Because if somebody goes into a really high state of consciousness and they think the world is a beautiful and magical place, which it is in that high state, but it's just a state, it's not a stage. So this is where E prime might come in handy. English prime minus the verb to be, and also adding in the time binding element. It would be, this is a magical and beautiful world at this state of consciousness. Or I'm really angry at this state of consciousness. So it could almost be a different type of English with the verb to be, as in, how is my being, how is my level and state of consciousness, and what is unfolding as a perception because of that. And if one hasn't necessarily gone to a certain state of consciousness before, it probably isn't a stage, and it probably isn't permanent. It's probably not embedded yet. It's not embedded in the neurology. It's just there energetically, and the energy has to take time to grow the physiology, and it has to actually be there long enough. And it's not just about personal either. So if I personally go to a really high level of consciousness and I come back down, there might actually be things that I need to resolve at the lower levels in order to earn that stage. For example, me shedding some of the mental health system stuff would be shedding some of the lower levels. And I did that consciously over a period of time instead of, I quit just overnight. And I quit overnight could be destabilizing, whereas having proper conversation and dialogue around the release of that level and having others see the validity of releasing that level could be helpful. Even now, my family's a little bit worried about me going to California. Now I could just say, screw you, bye. Or I could have dialogue about that transition that might make them see why I would go. And then in that way, there's not so much worry energy being projected there. And it's the same with mental illness diagnosis, supposed illness diagnosis. I've gone along with it for now, but I'm ready to start having conversations about how it could be a little bit different. And it has to be had at somewhere close to the level of the person, how they see it. If it's way out there, like if I say, it's not mental illness, it's Jesus, people aren't going to see that. They might be able to conceptualize that, but they're not going to see it. Whereas if I say, all this stuff about neuroplasticity and brain growth. If a person is a scientist in some way, they might see it. If they're not, they might still kind of understand. And the thing is with normal people, so-called normal people, they don't really have a vested interest in understanding it in different ways as much as people who have gone through the process themselves, because they can possibly transform and thrive. Though I do feel that it is of value in that if regular people could learn how to see and grow their brain again, then we'd be all doing the same thing. Again, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I have a few lines on my computer screen, but 70% I make up on the go. I'm thinking that one day I'll just talk and I won't have any prompts at all.